The void held its secrets well. For millennia, 6 massive structures drifted through the Gothic sector like forgotten gods, their origins lost to time, their purpose hidden beneath layers of shadow and mystery. The Imperium of Man discovered these cyclopean constructs in the early years of the 31st millennium, and Imperial scholars could make no sense of them. They were simply there, ancient beyond reckoning, constructed from materials that defied analysis and dating techniques that varied wildly between 17,000 and 300,000 years old. The architects remained unknown. The construction methods proved incomprehensible. Even the super-hardened onyx-like substance from which they were built resisted every attempt at classification or understanding. The administratum designated them simply as Blackstone fortresses, named for the mysterious material composing their hulls, and the pragmatic Imperial Navy turned them into the cornerstones of Battlefleet Gothic's defence network. These structures, even dormant with most of their systems offline, made incomparable foundations for naval bases. Their sheer size dwarfed even the mightiest Imperial star forts and segmentum fortresses. Their mass exceeded that of small moons. The Adeptus Mechanicus grafted Imperial weapon batteries onto their surfaces, installed life support systems throughout their corridors, and carved out hangars for fighter wings and escort craft. The tech priests worked with technology they could not fully comprehend, adding crude Imperial modifications to something far more sophisticated, like primitive humans painting on the walls of an ancient temple, without understanding the significance of what they defaced. For thousands of years, the Blackstone fortresses served their new masters well. They became symbols of Imperial might in the Gothic sector, massive anchor points around which entire fleet strategies revolved. Admirals planned their campaigns knowing these fortresses represented unassailable strongpoints in the sector's defence grid. The pride of Battlefleet Gothic rested on a simple belief that no enemy had ever captured a Blackstone fortress. That arrogance would prove catastrophic. What the Imperium failed to understand was that these structures were not merely ancient bases or abandoned space stations. They were weapons. Weapons created in an age when gods and their nightmares walked the stars. Weapons designed for a war that had raged when humanity still huddled in caves on distant Terra. And like all sleeping weapons, they waited only for someone who understood their true nature to awaken them. The Gothic War began slowly, as most sector-wide conflicts do, with scattered reports that seemed insignificant in isolation. In the year 139 M41, vessels began appearing adrift in the Athena sector, their crews stricken with diseases sacred to Nurgle, the Plague Lord. The Chaos warship Plague Claw was sighted multiple times, always vanishing before Imperial forces could engage. Astropaths reported disturbing disturbances in the warp, a growing pressure that seemed to build like a storm gathering strength. Then, in 142 M41, the storm broke. A catastrophic shockwave passed through the Immaterium, and the entire Gothic sector found itself engulfed in warp storms of unprecedented intensity. The sector was cut off, isolated from outside communication and reinforcement, left to face whatever was coming with only those forces already present. The isolation bred panic. Religious sects arose across the sector, proclaiming that the Emperor had turned his face from them in displeasure. Anarchy spread like a contagion, as civil order broke down on world after world. Then came the raiders, taking advantage of the chaos. Orc pirates struck at vulnerable convoys. Eldari corsairs materialized from the webway to plunder and vanish. Human pirates, seeing opportunity in the disorder, turned their guns on former allies. Through it all, the forces of chaos moved with purpose, coordinating attacks across multiple systems with unusual precision. In 143 M41, the true assault began. Chaos warfleets launched massive surprise attacks on Imperial naval bases throughout the Gothic sector, ambushing warships as they sat in dock, catching the Imperial Navy woefully unprepared. Orbital stations fell to boarding actions. Entire battle groups were destroyed before they could even raise void shields. The Imperial Navy took devastating losses in those first hours of coordinated violence. But worse was to come, for it quickly became apparent that these strikes had a specific pattern. The Chaos forces were targeting the 6 bases that held the Blackstone fortresses. The Rebo system fell first. 20 Chaos warships overwhelmed the defences of Blackstone Fortress 4, which orbited Rebo 5 as the primary naval base for the Cyclops cluster subsector. The fortress's power systems mysteriously shut down minutes before the attack, leaving it defenceless against the boarding parties that swarmed through its corridors. For the first time in Imperial history, a Blackstone fortress had been captured by an enemy. The shock reverberated through Battlefleet Gothic's command structure. If these supposedly impregnable bastions could fall, what hope remained for the sector's defence? More disasters followed in rapid succession. At the Cardinal World of Surveillon, Abaddon the Despoiler unveiled a weapon that would haunt Imperial nightmares for centuries to come. The Planet Killer, a massive warship bristling with reality-tearing weapons, took orbit over Surveillon, and with a single blast of its powerful main armament, blew the world to pieces. 14 billion Imperial citizens died in that instant, their world reduced to an asteroid field and expanding clouds of vaporized atmosphere. The effect on Imperial morale proved devastating. Panic spread through the Gothic sector as populations realized that entire worlds could be erased from existence. Yet this was merely a demonstration, a warning of what Abaddon could unleash if he chose. The Planet Killer was a tool of terror, yes, but it was not his ultimate objective. That became clear when more Blackstone fortresses fell to Chaos forces. Blackstone Fortress just at Fularis in the Pine Moor subsector was captured through means that remain unclear in Imperial records. Blackstone Fortress 6 at Brinaga in the Quinrox Sound subsector fell despite fierce resistance from the Adeptus Mechanicus installations that surrounded it. 3 of the 6 fortresses now belonged to Abaddon the Despoiler, and with them he would reveal the true horror these ancient weapons could unleash. The demonstration came at Fularis Taku. Exact information remained sketchy in Imperial records, suppressed or lost in the chaos of those dark years, but surviving accounts paint a picture of apocalypse. 2 Blackstone fortresses, working in coordination, unleashed beams of energy unlike anything in Imperial arsenals. These were not lance batteries or Nova cannons or any conventional weapon system. These were something else entirely, something that tore at the barrier between real space and the Immaterium itself. The beams struck Fularis 2 and simply unmade it. The atmosphere was stripped away in seconds. The oceans boiled into space. The surface was scoured bare, transformed from a living world to a barren, rocky plain. Millions died without even understanding what killed them. The Imperium finally understood what they faced. Abaddon the Despoiler had not launched this Black Crusade merely to raid or destroy. He had come to capture the Blackstone fortresses, and he knew something about these ancient structures that the Imperium, for all its history and records, had never discovered. He could activate them. He could control them. He could use them as they were meant to be used, as weapons capable of destroying worlds with casual ease. The question that haunted every Imperial commander was simple and terrifying. How had Abaddon learned their secrets? The answer lay buried in prophecy and manipulation, in the schemes of beings older than the Imperium itself. At some point during M40, Abaddon the Despoiler received visions from Zarafistan, his cabal of sorcerers who served as his diviners and advisors. These visions led him to an Aeldari crone world, one of those nightmare realms that orbited within the Eye of Terror itself, where the souls of dead Eldari were claimed by She Who Thirsts. There, amid ruins that screamed with ancient agonies, Abaddon found a prophecy written in a tongue older than the Imperium, older perhaps than humanity itself. The prophecy revealed the existence of the Blackstone fortresses, and more importantly their purpose and power. But this discovery was not mere fortune. The visions that led Abaddon to that crone world, the prophecy he found there, all of it had been orchestrated by a being of incomprehensible cunning and malice. Mephetran the Deceiver, one of the ancient Citan star gods who had waged war against the Old Ones millions of years ago, had manipulated events to guide Abaddon to this knowledge. The Deceiver's reasons remained his own, shrouded in plans within plans, but the result was clear. Abaddon now possessed not only the locations of the Blackstone fortresses, but also the means to control them. Those means took physical form in 2 alien artifacts of tremendous power. The Hand of Darkness and the Eye of Night, ancient devices whose origins traced back to the war in heaven itself, the primordial conflict that had shaped the galaxy in ways still felt millions of years later. These artifacts allowed Abaddon to remotely control the Blackstone fortresses, to access systems that the Adeptus Mechanicus had never even known existed, to strip away the crude Imperial modifications and reveal the true capabilities hidden beneath. With these tools in hand, Abaddon could activate the fortress's dormant systems and unleash their primary weapon, the thing they had been built to wield, the warp cannon. That name, assigned by Imperial scholars trying to categorize something beyond their comprehension, failed to capture the true horror of what these weapons could do. They were not cannons in any conventional sense. They did not fire projectiles or energy beams like Imperial lance batteries. Instead, they broke the barrier between real space and warp space, creating rifts through which the raw stuff of the immaterium could pour forth. These beams of pure chaos, of unfiltered warp energy, destroyed everything in their path not through conventional physics, but by unmaking reality itself. Void shields offered no protection. Armor provided no defense. Matter simply ceased to exist where these beams touched. And more terrifying still was their ability to link together. Multiple Blackstone fortresses could coordinate their fire, combining their warp cannons into a single beam of exponentially greater power. Abaddon demonstrated this capability with devastating effect. 2 fortresses combined their fire to scour Polaris II clean of all life and atmosphere. Then, as Imperial reinforcements finally began arriving from neighbouring sectors after nearly a decade of isolation, Abaddon brought all 3 captured fortresses to the Tarantis system, the primary mustering point for those reinforcements. The Tarantis star had burned for billions of years, a stable main sequence star around which an entire system of mining worlds and industrial facilities orbited. It anchored trade routes and served as a navigational reference point for countless journeys through the sector. In a matter of hours, Abaddon ended its existence. 3 Blackstone fortresses, their warp cannons linked and synchronized, unleashed their combined power directly into the star itself. The effect was cataclysmic beyond imagination. The star's fusion processes were disrupted, its internal balance shattered. It went supernova, a violent explosion that released more energy in seconds than it had generated in its entire previous lifespan. Everything in the Tarantis system died. Every mining outpost, every orbital station, every ship that had gathered there for the final push to relieve the Gothic sector, all of it was vaporized in the expanding wave of radiation and superheated plasma. The death toll numbered in the millions. Entire Imperial Guard regiments that had travelled across light years to aid in the Gothic sector's defence never even saw combat. They simply ceased to exist, erased from reality along with the star system they had thought would be their staging ground. The psychological impact of witnessing a star destroyed through artificial means shattered what remained of Imperial morale in the Gothic sector. Yet even in the depths of this disaster, seeds of resistance remained. Lord High Admiral Cornelius Ravensburg, the flag officer commanding Battlefleet Gothic, refused to accept defeat. He had weathered the initial surprise attacks, rallied scattered Imperial forces and maintained a fighting retreat while preserving his fleet's strength. Now, as reinforcements finally began trickling in from neighbouring sectors, as the warp storm slowly abated, Ravensburg saw an opportunity to take the fight to the enemy. He would need allies, even unlikely ones, to have any hope of success. The Eldari had watched the Gothic War unfold with growing alarm. They knew the Blackstone fortresses by another name, the Talismans of Vol, weapons forged by their smith god in the mythic past of their race. Eldari legend spoke of 100 such weapons created to arm Cain. The bloody-handed god of war, in his eternal struggle against the forces that threatened the Eldari race. Whether these legends represented actual history or symbolic memory remained unclear, but what was certain was that the Eldari recognized these fortresses as weapons never meant to fall into the hands of chaos. The formation of an alliance between the Imperium and the Eldari proved difficult. Centuries of mutual distrust and warfare could not be easily overcome, yet circumstances forced cooperation. Eldari Corsair Prince Eldrathan Voidstinger, cornered by Orc pirates in the Graildark Nebula during 151 M41, made the unprecedented decision to request aid from Imperial forces. Admiral Ravensburg, seeing an opportunity to gain valuable intelligence about chaos movements in the sector, agreed to assist. The combined Imperial and Eldari forces destroyed the Orc fleet, and in the aftermath Eldrathan shared a vision his Fascia had received. This vision revealed that an Imperial Navy captain named Elias Oka had been corrupted by chaos, and was feeding information to Abaddon's forces. The elimination of this traitor struck a significant blow against chaos intelligence networks in the sector. More importantly, the alliance proved that cooperation between the ancient enemies was possible. Eldari Farseers brought their ability to glimpse possible futures, to track warp currents, and predict where chaos forces would strike next. Imperial forces provided raw military might and the determination to hold ground that the more mobile Eldari could not match. Together they began to turn the tide of the Gothic War. The decisive moment came when Imperial scouts located a major Chaos fleet moving toward the Gethsemane system. Ravensburg saw his chance and took it, leading 17 capital ships and 20 escorts in a direct assault on the Chaos forces. The Battle of Gethsemane marked the first major Imperial victory of the Gothic War. Ravensburg's forces tore into the Chaos fleet with precise coordination, targeting vulnerable ships and avoiding costly frontal assaults. The Chaos Warmaster commanding the enemy fleet, seeing his forces taking devastating losses, ordered a retreat. But as the Chaos vessels turned to flee, they found themselves under attack from behind. An Eldari fleet, seemingly materializing from nowhere through some webway portals, struck at the Chaos rear guard. Caught between the hammer of the Imperial Navy and the anvil of the Eldari forces, the Chaos fleet was annihilated. Not a single enemy vessel escaped. The psychological impact of this victory proved as important as the tactical success. Imperial forces, which had suffered defeat after defeat for years, finally had proof that the Chaos invasion could be stopped. Morale surged throughout Battlefleet Gothic. Recruitment drives saw volunteers flooding into the Imperial Guard regiments defending the sector. Most crucially, the victory at Gethsemane coincided with the warp storms that had isolated the Gothic sector, finally beginning to abate. Reinforcements poured in from neighbouring sectors, including elements from several Space Marine chapters like the White Consuls, Exorcists and Red Talons. These fresh forces, combined with what remained of Battlefleet Gothic and their new Eldari allies, gave the Imperium the strength it needed for one final push. Abaddon the Despoiler, furious at the prospect of defeat after coming so close to total victory, made a desperate gambit. He would use all 3 of his captured Blackstone fortresses in a coordinated assault on the system, where Blackstone Fortress 5 remained in Imperial hands, Schindelgeist. If he could capture a 4th fortress and eliminate the remaining Imperial-controlled ones, he could still salvage victory from the jaws of defeat. The stage was set for the final decisive battle of the Gothic War. The Imperial Eldari fleet tracked Abaddon's forces to the Schindelgeist system, and assembled for what both sides knew would be the war's climactic engagement. The forces gathered there represented the largest concentration of military power seen in the Gothic sector in centuries. On the Chaos side, Abaddon commanded not only his 3 Blackstone fortresses, but also multiple war fleets, each led by powerful Chaos champions, along with support from Traitor Guard regiments, Dark Mechanicum forces, and demonic entities summoned from the Warp. The Imperial Eldari alliance matched this with the combined might of what remained of Battlefleet Gothic, reinforcements from across the Segmentum Obscurus, Space Marine strike forces, and the elegant but deadly vessels of multiple Eldari craft worlds. As the 2 fleets closed to engagement range, Abaddon began powering up his 3 Blackstone fortresses for a coordinated strike. His plan was simple but devastating. Destroy the Schindelgeist star itself, annihilating everything in the system including Blackstone Fortress 5th and the entire Imperial fleet. The warp cannons began to charge, reality warping around them as the barriers between real space and the immaterium grew thin. In minutes, perhaps seconds, they would fire and another star would die. Then Captain Abradol of the Imperial Navy vessel, Flame of Purity, did something that would be remembered in Imperial legends for millennia. Seeing the Blackstone fortresses building toward their catastrophic strike, understanding that nothing in the Imperial fleet could withstand the combined power of 3 warp cannons, he made a choice. The Flame of Purity broke formation and accelerated at maximum burn toward the convergence point where the 3 fortress beams would meet. The crew, understanding what their captain intended, maintained their stations without protest. They knew they were already dead. The only question was whether their deaths would matter. The Flame of Purity reached the convergence point just as the 3 warp cannons fired. The ship was caught in the combined beams of pure immaterium energy and simply ceased to exist. But in that moment of destruction, something remarkable happened. The ship's mass, its Geller field still active even as the vessel died, disrupted the careful synchronization Abaddon had achieved. The 3 beams did not merge into a single devastating strike. Instead, they scattered. Their power dissipated across empty space rather than focused on the Schindelgeist star. Captain Abradal and everyone aboard the Flame of Purity gave their lives to save the system, and their sacrifice would not be in vain. With the immediate threat of stellar destruction negated, the Imperial Eldari fleet closed with Abaddon's forces. What followed was a battle of unprecedented scale and violence. Ships the size of cities exchanged fire at ranges measured in thousands of kilometers. Lance batteries carved through void shields and armor. Torpedo spreads filled space with nuclear fire. Boarding actions saw Space Marines fighting Chaos Space Marines in the corridors of crippled vessels. Eldari fighters danced through clouds of flak to deliver precision strikes on vital systems. The battle raged for hours, neither side willing to yield, both knowing that defeat here meant the end of everything they fought for. The Imperial Navy and Angels of Redemption managed to board one of Abaddon's Blackstone fortresses during the chaos of battle. The boarding party fought through corridors that seemed to pulse with malevolent life, facing chaos cultists and defensive systems that appeared to have minds of their own. Those who survived to make reports described the activated fortress as being like a living thing, its systems responding not to mechanical logic but to something approaching consciousness. They pushed deeper into the structure, fighting every meter, until they reached what they believed to be a critical system nexus. The charges they placed detonated, and the Blackstone fortress they had boarded began to shudder and convulse. What happened next shocked both sides of the conflict. The recaptured Blackstone fortress self-destructed, not through any action by Imperial forces but seemingly through its own choice. The explosion was massive, sending debris cascading through the battlefield and destroying several nearby vessels on both sides. But more terrible still was what followed. Across the Gothic sector, at bases and systems far from the battle at Schindelgeist, the other Blackstone fortresses under Imperial control also self-destructed. 3 fortresses, Blackstone Fortresses 2, 3, and 5, all detonated within minutes of each other despite being separated by light years. The synchronized destruction suggested coordination beyond anything the Imperium could explain. Inquisitor Horst, who had been tracking the Blackstone fortresses throughout the Gothic War and investigating their nature, concluded that some things were simply too dangerous to exist. Someone or something had decided that the Blackstone fortresses fell into that category and had activated whatever failsafe system caused their destruction. Whether this was the work of their original creators, some lingering artificial intelligence within the fortresses themselves, or intervention by another party entirely, none could say. What was certain was that of the 6 Blackstone fortresses that had existed at the war's start, only 2 remained, both in Abaddon's hands. With 4 fortresses destroyed, and his forces taking catastrophic losses against the Imperial Eldari alliance, Abaddon the Despoiler made the decision to retreat. His Black Fleet turned and fled toward the Eye of Terror, taking with them the 2 surviving Blackstone fortresses. The Imperial fleet pursued but could not catch the faster Chaos vessels before they entered the warp and vanished into the nightmare realm of the Eye. The Gothic War was over. The Imperium had survived, though at a cost measured in billions of lives, hundreds of ships and countless worlds devastated by the conflict. The victory, such as it was, proved Pyrrhic. The Gothic sector had been ravaged, its population decimated, its industrial capacity shattered. Recovery would take decades, perhaps centuries, and hanging over everything was the knowledge that Abaddon had escaped with 2 Blackstone fortresses. Their existence represented a threat that could not be ignored but also could not be eliminated. Inquisitor Horst dedicated what remained of his life to tracking those fortresses and learning their ultimate fate. He would be seen only twice more in Imperial records, once during the Second War for Armageddon, and again when he aided Inquisitor Katarina Greyfax in searching for the Eye of Night after 999 M40, a quest that apparently cost Horst his life. The Gothic War ended in 160 M41, nearly 21 years after it had begun. For those who survived, life eventually returned to something resembling normalcy, though the sector would never truly recover from the trauma of those years. The Blackstone fortresses entered Imperial legend as cautionary tales about the dangers of ancient Xenos technology and the importance of understanding the weapons one possessed. But legends fade with time, and memories grow dim. 800 years would pass before the galaxy was reminded of what the Blackstone fortresses could do. 800 years passed. The Gothic sector rebuilt itself, though the scars of the Gothic War never truly healed. Abaddon the Despoiler remained in the Eye of Terror with his 2 captured Blackstone fortresses, planning and scheming while the Imperium watched the Cadian Gate with mounting anxiety. The question was never if Abaddon would return, but when and what horrors he would unleash when he did. That question was answered in 999 M41, when the 13th of Abaddon's Black Crusades erupted from the Eye of Terror like a tide of darkness threatening to drown the galaxy. The problem Abaddon faced during those 8 centuries was control. The Blackstone fortresses resisted him in ways he had not anticipated. These were not mere machines to be commanded through the Hand of Darkness and Eye of Night. They possessed something approaching sentience, a machine consciousness that evaluated those who sought to control them and chose whether to comply or resist. One of his 2 captured fortresses proved particularly troublesome. Abaddon attempted to seize absolute control through demonic possession, binding entities of the warp directly into the fortress's systems. The gambit backfired catastrophically. The demon-possessed fortress became unpredictable, dangerous even to chaos forces, its machine spirit driven insane by the conflicting imperatives of its original programming and the demonic entities trying to override it. This fortress remained dangerous and unstable, a weapon that could turn on its wielder without warning. For the will of eternity, Abaddon found a different solution. He could not trust demons to control something so powerful, so he created something new, something that had never existed before. In the hidden laboratories of the Black Legion, dark apothecaries worked on Abaddon's orders to grow an artificial being, a woman whose body was suffused with Noctilith, the Blackstone material from which the fortresses themselves were constructed. This fusion of human flesh and alien material created a being uniquely suited to interface with the Blackstone fortress, to commune with its machine consciousness in ways no other human could achieve. Her name was Dravura Morkath, and she was raised from infancy to believe a lie. Abaddon implanted false memories in her mind, convincing her that she had been spawned by the will of eternity itself as an emissary, discovered as a child by the War Master, and adopted as his daughter. She grew to adulthood believing she was literally the child of the fortress, that her purpose was to serve as its voice and its control mechanism. Her loyalty to Abaddon was absolute, fanatically devoted to proving herself worthy of his adoptive care. She served not only as his link to the will of eternity, but also as his cupbearer, a position of trust that placed her at the center of Black Legion politics. Her psychic abilities allowed her to read the minds of Abaddon's lieutenants, detecting schemes and maintaining the delicate balance between the 4 chaos gods whose champions constantly vied for dominance within the Legion. Dravura Morkath represented Abaddon's genius for manipulation and his ruthless pragmatism. He had created a perfect tool, one that served him with unwavering devotion while remaining ignorant of the truth of her own existence. Through her, he could control the will of eternity with a precision that the Hand of Darkness and Eye of Night alone could never provide. She was the bridge between human consciousness and alien technology, between the War Master's will and the fortress's devastating power. And like all of Abaddon's tools, she would ultimately be sacrificed when her usefulness was exhausted. The 13th Black Crusade began with calculated deception. Abaddon launched an initial assault on Cadia using largely second-rate forces, troops and ships he could afford to lose in what appeared to be a conventional invasion. The defenders of Cadia, led by Lord Castellan Yursarkar E. Creed, repelled this first wave after weeks of brutal fighting. Imperial forces celebrated what seemed to be a decisive victory. Chaos forces retreated on all fronts. The Cadian defenders, exhausted but triumphant, began to disperse their forces to other threatened sectors. Creed, however, remained uneasy. The victory had come too easily. Abaddon the Despoiler had not led the attack personally, and the forces committed seemed insufficient for a serious assault on the most heavily fortified world in the Imperium. The Lord Castellan's instincts proved correct. As Imperial fleets departed and defensive positions were scaled back, the Eye of Terror disgorged a second invasion force that dwarfed the first. This was Abaddon's true assault, held in reserve until the defenders had been lulled into believing the threat had passed. At the head of this, Armada flew the Blackstone Fortress Will of Eternity, its systems fully activated, its warp cannon charged and ready. Aboard the Vengeful Spirit, Abaddon's flagship, the War Master commanded the greatest concentration of chaos forces assembled since the Horus Heresy. The Black Legion marched to war alongside elements from all the traitor legions, supported by demonic hosts, traitor guard regiments, dark mechanicum war engines and corrupted Titan legions. The sky above Cadia turned black with descending drop pods and landing craft. Battlefleet Cadia, caught unprepared by this second wave, suffered devastating losses in the opening engagements. The Will of Eternity alone accounted for dozens of Imperial vessels, its conventional weapons augmented by the reality-warping power of its warp cannon. Ships struck by that terrible weapon simply ceased to exist, erased from reality as the Immaterium reached through the tiers in space to claim them. The Imperial Navy fought with desperate courage but was driven back system by system, unable to match the overwhelming force Abaddon had committed to this final assault. On Cadia's surface, Lord Castellan Creed struggled to coordinate a coherent defence as Chaos forces landed across multiple continents. The problem was not lack of military skill or insufficient forces, but the nature of the defenders themselves. Space Marine chapters operated according to their own tactical doctrines, often refusing to coordinate with guard elements. The Space Wolves, under Wolf Lord Sven Bloodhowl, decided independently to launch a boarding assault on the Will of Eternity rather than defend assigned positions on the surface. The Dark Angel's Fourth Company pursued its own mysterious objectives. The Black Templars fought with suicidal zeal that cost them casualties they could not afford. Creed needed an army working in concert, but he commanded a collection of proud warriors each fighting their own war, yet despite the chaos and the overwhelming enemy numbers, Cadia held. The world had been transformed over millennia into the ultimate fortress, every city a stronghold, every citizen a potential soldier. From the earliest age, Cadians learned to field strip weapons before learning to read, tactical doctrine memorized before basic literacy. The planet's geography itself favoured defence, with narrow mountain passes and heavily fortified urban centres called casas. The defenders fought with the grim determination of those who knew no retreat was possible. Cadia stood as the linchpin of the Cadian Gate, the only stable, permanent route into and out of the Eye of Terror large enough for battle fleets. If Cadia fell, the Eye would expand unchecked, and Abaddon's path to terror would lie open. The turning point came when unlikely allies intervened. Trazyn the Infinite, the Necron overlord who collected rare artifacts and specimens across the galaxy, detected massive disturbances emanating from the Eye of Terror. His collection on Solemnus had been devastated by upheavals in the warp, prompting him to investigate the source. Using the Celestial Orrery, a device capable of tracking cosmic phenomena across the galaxy, he traced the disturbances to Cadia. Simultaneously, Archmagos Dominus Belisarius Cawl received guidance from the Harlequin Shadowseer Silandri Veilwalker, who directed him to investigate an abandoned world devastated during the Fourth Black Crusade. There, Cawl discovered pylons identical to those on Cadia, mysterious black stone structures that predated human colonization. The pylons were the key. For millennia, Imperial scholars had puzzled over these structures without understanding their purpose. They were constructed from blackstone, the same material as the fortresses, but their function remained mysterious. Now, as the warp storms generated by the massive Chaos invasion threatened to engulf Cadia entirely, the pylons began resonating with an almost imperceptible vibration. Microscopic fractures appeared on their surfaces. They were attempting to fight back against the encroaching warp, generating a field similar to a Geller field, but on a planetary scale. 5,810 intact pylons stood across Cadia's surface, with 2,000 more buried or damaged. Together, they formed a network capable of pushing back against the Immaterium itself, preventing the Eye of Terror from expanding through the Cadian Gate. Cawl and Trazyn, working in uneasy cooperation, began the process of fully activating the pylon network. The technology was Necron in origin, created during the War in Heaven as a defense against the warp-based weapons the Old Ones had deployed. The pylons could create tetrahedral regions of space-time immune to incursions from the Immaterium, essentially creating zones where warp energy could not manifest. If the network could be activated at full power, it would not only protect Cadia, but potentially seal the Eye of Terror itself, trapping the Chaos forces and preventing reinforcements from emerging. Abaddon recognized the threat immediately. Through Dravura Morkath, he attempted to fire the Will of Eternity's warp cannon at Cadia, intending to destroy the planet before the pylons could be activated. Morkath channeled her will through the fortress, drawing on her deep connection to its systems. The massive weapon began charging, reality warping around it as the barrier between real space and the warp grew thin. But the fortress itself resisted. Despite Morkath's control, the Will of Eternity possessed a will of its own, a machine consciousness that evaluated the righteousness of its commands. The fortress had been created to fight the powers of the warp, not to serve them. Deep within its systems, something remembered its original purpose. On Cadia's surface, the activation of the pylon network was proceeding, though not without cost. Space Wolves and Cadian Guard elements had managed to board the Will of Eternity despite Abaddon's attempts to stop them. Wolflord Sven Bloodhowl led the assault, fighting through corridors that seemed to pulse with malevolent life. Abaddon himself teleported aboard one of the Imperial vessels, slaughtering boarding forces with casual ease, but some made it through. Dravura Morkath was tasked with tracking down and eliminating the intruders, but the Will of Eternity itself seemed to be helping them, rearranging passageways to guide them toward critical systems, refusing to activate defensive measures that would have killed them. The fortress was fighting against its own master. The Imperial boarding party reached the shield generators at the heart of the fortress. As they placed demolition charges, Abaddon and his Black Legion elite ambushed them, cutting down Space Marines and Guardsmen alike. But they were too late. The charges detonated and the Will of Eternity's shields collapsed. At that moment, the Imperial Fist's Mobile Star Fortress phalanx arrived in the Cadian system, its massive weapons trained on the now vulnerable Blackstone Fortress. The phalanx was a relic from the Great Crusade, one of the most powerful vessels in the Imperial arsenal, and its firepower was devastating. Lance batteries and Nova cannons opened fire, and the Will of Eternity, stripped of its defenses, was crippled. Its weapon systems went offline, its propulsion failed. It hung in Cadian orbit, a dying giant whose warp cannon would never fire again. On Cadia's surface, Magos Cal and Trazyn succeeded in activating the full pylon network. The effect was immediate and spectacular. A field of anti-psychic energy spread across the planet and beyond, pushing back against the warp. Demons manifesting on Cadia's surface screamed as they were banished back to the Immaterium. The Eye of Terror itself began to shrink, its influence weakened by the pylon's power. Even St. Celestine, the living saint who had led Imperial forces with miraculous powers, felt her strength fading as the warp's touch was cut off from Cadia. Abaddon, in the final battle beneath the planet's surface, found himself facing not only Creed's forces, but also the realization that his centuries of planning were unraveling. The confrontation between Abaddon and the Imperial defenders was brief but brutal. St. Celestine, weakened by the pylons but still defiant, stood against the War Master. Creed and his Kasrkin elite fought with desperate courage. Inquisitor Katarina Greyfax unleashed psychic attacks that momentarily distracted Abaddon. In the confusion, Celestine managed to stab Abaddon in the back, wounding him grievously. The War Master, facing defeat for the first time in the campaign, made the decision to retreat. He teleported back to the Vengeful Spirit, his wounds forcing him to abandon the battlefield. But Abaddon the Despoiler had not survived 10,000 years by accepting defeat. If he could not claim Cadia through conquest, he would ensure that no one else could hold it either. Aboard the Vengeful Spirit, nursing wounds that would have killed any normal warrior, he gave the order that would seal Cadia's fate. The Will of Eternity, crippled and powerless in orbit, would become a kinetic weapon. Engines were attached to the massive fragments of the dying fortress. Course calculations were made, and then, with Dravura Morkath still aboard, the Will of Eternity was hurled toward Cadia's surface. Morkath pleaded with Abaddon through their psychic connection. The move was unnecessary, she insisted. She could restore the Will of Eternity's power. She could still conquer Cadia in his name. The fortress could be salvaged, used to drive on Terror itself, but Abaddon had made his calculation. He had grown too fond of her, revealed too much of himself to her. She had become a liability, someone who knew his weaknesses and his doubts. In warfare, such liabilities could not be tolerated no matter the personal cost. Desperate, Morkath asked only that Abaddon acknowledge her as his daughter before she died, that he give her that one truth before the end. The War Master's response was quiet and final. He said, "I am sorry, Morkath. I have disappointed you, but in my experience that's what fathers do." Then he cut communications and watched as the Blackstone Fortress fell. The impact of the will of eternity on Cadia's surface exceeded every nightmare scenario Imperial tacticians had imagined. The kinetic energy released was equivalent to multiple cyclonic torpedoes detonating simultaneously. The impact site vaporized instantly, superheated wind roaring outward at velocities that exceeded the speed of sound. Those beneath the impact perished first, flesh seared from bone before their nerves could register pain. The shockwave spread across continents, leveling cities, flattening mountains, boiling oceans. The tectonic stress caused by the impact shattered Cadia's crust, sending continent-sized plates grinding against each other. The pylon network, despite its power, could not withstand this level of physical destruction. One by one, the ancient structures crumbled, their blackstone construction failing under stresses it was never designed to endure. With the pylons destroyed, the anti-psychic field collapsed. The Eye of Terror stopped shrinking and began to expand once more, now freed from the constraints that had held it in check for millennia. Warp energy poured through the breach, claiming what remained of Cadia. The planet's atmosphere ignited. The ground itself became molten. Reality warped and twisted as the Immaterium reached out to claim the broken world. Lord Castellan Creed, the man who had held Cadia against impossible odds, remained on the surface with his Cadian 8th Regiment, holding the line to cover the evacuation of survivors. As the planet was dragged into the warp, Creed mysteriously disappeared, his fate unknown. Some claimed Trazyn the Infinite added him to his collection. Others believed he was claimed by Chaos. Most simply mourned him as another hero lost to the darkness. St. Celestine, her powers restored as warp energy flooded back into the Cadian system, led the evacuation fleet. The phalanx provided escort as Imperial vessels desperately fled the dying world. Of Cadia's billions of inhabitants, fewer than 3 million escaped. The rest died as their world tore itself apart, the fragments consumed by the expanding Eye of Terror. The geothermal instability caused by the Blackstone Fortress's impact finally caused Cadia to rupture completely. The planet that had stood for 10,000 years as the guardian of the Imperium, the rock upon which countless Black Crusades had broken, was gone. Only the Maxim remained, carved into the hearts of every survivor. Cadia stands. Not as a world, but as an idea, a refusal to yield even in the face of annihilation. The destruction of Cadia achieved what 10,000 years of warfare had not. The Eye of Terror expanded unchecked, no longer constrained by the pylon network. But more catastrophically, the destruction of Cadia was part of a larger pattern Abaddon had been executing across his 13 Black Crusades. Each crusade had targeted worlds with Blackstone pylons, slowly dismantling the network the Necrons had created during the War in Heaven. With Cadia's destruction, the final anchor point was eliminated. The result was the Great Rift, a massive tear in reality that split the galaxy in half. The Cicatrix Maledictum, as it came to be known, was a wound in space-time through which the Immaterium poured into real space across hundreds of light-years. Half the Imperium found itself cut off from Terra, isolated in what became known as the Dark Imperium or Imperium Nihilus, where the Emperor's light could not reach and hope died in the darkness. Abaddon had achieved his ultimate objective. The Crimson Path, his plan to open a route from the Eye of Terror to Terra itself, was complete. The galaxy had been fundamentally altered, its very structure changed by the opening of the Great Rift. The age of the Imperium, that long period of slow decline and desperate defence, had ended. The era Indomitus had begun, an age of darkness where humanity fought not for victory but mere survival. The Blackstone fortresses proved to be the key to this apocalypse. One fortress, the Will of Eternity, had been destroyed, accomplishing what the warp cannon never could. Its massive hulk, falling from orbit, had struck the single most important world in the Imperium's defensive network and shattered it beyond recovery. The kinetic weapon succeeded where reality-warping superweapons had failed, a brutal reminder that sometimes the simplest solution is the most effective. One merely needs to be willing to pay the price. The other, Blackstone Fortress Abaddon had captured, the one driven mad by demonic possession, had been gifted to Huron Blackheart of the Red Corsairs in the aftermath of the Badaba War. This gesture served multiple purposes. It secured the Red Corsairs' support for the 13th Black Crusade, demonstrating Abaddon's power by showing he could afford to give away such a weapon. It also rid him of a dangerously unstable asset without having to destroy it himself. The demon-possessed fortress remained unpredictable, but that was now Huron's problem, not Abaddon's. The fortress later played a role during the Terran Crusade when it was used to imprison the resurrected Primarch Robert Guilliman and his followers after their capture by forces serving Kairos Fateweaver. Guilliman's imprisonment in the Blackstone Fortress demonstrated another aspect of these ancient weapons. They contained webway gates within their structures, portals into the Eldari's network of extra-dimensional tunnels that connected distant parts of the galaxy. The Fallen Angel Cypher and the Harlequin Shadowseer Salandri Veilwalker used these gates to free Guilliman and his forces, leading them through the fortress's interior to escape. Later, Harlequins of the Mask of the Shattered Mirage, aided by a rogue faction from Craftworld Imlock, launched an attack on Huron's Blackstone Fortress, attempting to capture this talisman of Vol for their own purposes. The Eldari recognized these structures for what they truly were, weapons created in the War in Heaven, tools forged to fight the Citan and their Necron servants. The true nature and origin of the Blackstone fortresses remained shrouded in mystery, even after the events of the Gothic War and the fall of Cadia. Imperial scholars debated whether they were created by the Old Ones or by the ancient Eldari, whether they were weapons or something else entirely. Eldari mythology named them the Talismans of Vol, claiming they were forged by their smith god to end the War in Heaven. According to these legends, each fortress contained the souls of Eldari seers who had perished in that ancient conflict, bound into the structures to power them. At their heart sat Eyes of the Witch, gifts from the crone goddess Morai Heg, which allowed these trapped spirits to channel unfathomable amounts of energy from the Immaterium to banish the Ingir, the Citan star gods. Some Imperial sources suggested the Blackstone fortresses played a role in shattering the Citan during the Necron Revolt. The Void Dragon, one of the most powerful Citan, was said to have been weakened by these weapons, possibly even shattered into the shards that were later imprisoned across the galaxy. Whether the fortresses accomplished this alone or in cooperation with Necron forces remained unclear, but the connection between Blackstone technology and the War in Heaven was undeniable. The material itself, Noctilith, possessed properties unlike anything else in the galaxy. Depending on its polarization, Blackstone could either neutralize warp energy completely or amplify it tremendously, creating weapons of devastating power or shields against the Immaterium. After the fall of Cadia and the opening of the Great Rift, additional Blackstone fortresses were discovered across the galaxy. A seventh fortress was found in the western reaches of Segmentum Pacificus, drifting in an uncharted region of space surrounded by a debris field of ancient wrecks spanning millions of miles. This fortress bore many names across countless languages and cultures: the Dark Star, Old Unfathomable, the Eater of the Dead. It became the focus of exploration by scavengers and adventurers who established a way station called Precipice near the structure. Unlike the other known fortresses, this one continually reshaped its own interior, making consistent mapping impossible. Some claimed it was not even from the Milky Way galaxy, that its origins lay in some distant realm beyond comprehension. Additional fortresses were located in Ultima Segmentum, near territories controlled by various Necron dynasties, an eighth fortress near the Nekthist dynasty, a ninth in the outer regions of the Segmentum, a 10th in Segmentum Pacificus near the Thoct dynasty, an 11th in Segmentum Obscurus monitored by the Eldari. Each discovery raised more questions than answers. How many Blackstone fortresses existed in total? Were they all the same, or did they serve different purposes? Why were they scattered across the galaxy rather than concentrated in one location? The answers remained elusive, buried in a past so ancient that even the Eldari, whose race dated back millions of years, could only guess at the truth. What was clear was that these structures represented technology beyond anything the current races of the galaxy could create. Even the Adeptus Mechanicus, with all their knowledge and resources, could barely understand the most basic functions of a Blackstone fortress. The Necrons, despite their advanced science, treated these structures with caution and respect, suggesting even they did not fully comprehend what the Old Ones or their own ancient enemies had created. The Eldari Farseers spoke of them in prophecy and legend, but even their visions could not penetrate all the mysteries these fortresses held. The power source of a Blackstone fortress defied easy explanation. At the centre of each structure burned a core that resembled a miniature sun, generating immense amounts of energy even while dormant. This core's workings remained beyond the understanding of even the heretic tech priests of the Dark Mechanicum. It seemed to draw power directly from the warp itself, channeling the raw energies of the Immaterium in ways that should have been impossible. The fortresses could maintain this power generation indefinitely, never requiring fuel or maintenance, suggesting a level of technological sophistication that made current Imperial science seem primitive by comparison. The sentience the fortresses displayed added another layer of mystery. They were not simply machines following programmed instructions. They evaluated those who sought to control them, making judgments about worthiness and purpose. They could help or hinder, cooperate or resist, based on criteria only they understood. When defending themselves, the fortresses could manifest jagged shards from floors and walls to impale intruders, rearrange corridors to trap or guide those who wandered their halls, and deploy exotic defensive constructs like spindle drones and urguls against hostile forces. This suggested not just advanced automation, but genuine artificial intelligence, machine consciousness operating according to principles established millions of years ago. The legacy of the Blackstone fortresses extends far beyond their direct military impact. They demonstrated that weapons created in the distant past could resurface to reshape the present, that wars fought millions of years ago could still echo through the millennia. The war in heaven, that primordial conflict between the Old Ones and the Citan, had left scars across the galaxy that never fully healed. The Blackstone fortresses were just one example of such scars, sleeping weapons waiting for the right circumstances to awaken and remind the younger races that they inhabited a galaxy shaped by forces beyond their comprehension. For the Imperium, the Blackstone fortresses represented both a catastrophic failure and a terrible warning. The failure lay in never understanding what they possessed, in using these ancient weapons as mere naval bases without investigating their true capabilities. Had Imperial scholars unlocked the secrets of the fortresses, had the Adeptus Mechanicus devoted sufficient resources to studying them, rather than simply grafting Imperial technology onto their surfaces, perhaps the Gothic War could have been prevented. Perhaps the fall of Cadia could have been avoided. But the Imperium's rigid orthodoxy and fear of innovation prevented such investigations, and that failure cost them dearly. The warning was simpler, but more profound. The galaxy contained forces and technologies from ages past that modern races could barely understand, let alone control. The Blackstone fortresses proved that ancient weapons, if they fell into the wrong hands, could accomplish what entire armies could not. Abaddon's capture of just 3 fortresses had nearly destroyed an entire sector. His use of one fortress as a kinetic weapon had achieved what 10 millennia of conventional warfare had failed to accomplish, breaking the Cadian Gate and opening the path to terror. What other ancient weapons lay dormant across the galaxy, waiting for someone clever or desperate enough to awaken them? What other tools from the war in heaven slumbered in forgotten voids, their power undiminished by the passage of millions of years? The story of the Blackstone fortresses is ultimately a story about hubris and ignorance. The Imperium's hubris in believing it could claim and use anything it discovered without consequence. The ignorance that comes from rejecting innovation and investigation in favour of dogma and tradition. These twin failures transformed what could have been the greatest defensive assets in the Imperium's arsenal into weapons that nearly destroyed it. The fortresses themselves remained neutral, or as close to neutral as ancient weapons could be. They served those who could control them, but they also retained some memory of their original purpose, some echo of the directive that had been programmed into them eons ago. That purpose appears to have been the defeat of the Xtan and the protection of organic life against the soulless Necrons. The warp cannons, those terrible weapons that could tear holes in reality itself, were specifically designed to exploit the Citan's vulnerability to warp energy. The Citan, beings of pure material existence, could manipulate matter and energy with godlike power, but they could not enter the warp and were vulnerable to its energies. The Blackstone fortresses allowed their wielders to weaponize the Immaterium, to channel its chaotic power into devastating beams that could destroy even star gods. That such weapons now existed in a galaxy where the Citan had been shattered into shards, where the war in heaven had ended millions of years ago, created a situation where tools designed for one conflict were being used for something entirely different. Abaddon's use of the Blackstone fortresses represented the ultimate perversion of their original purpose. Where they had been created to protect organic life against extinction, Abaddon used them to enable chaos. the force that sought to consume all reality and transform it into an extension of the warp. Where they had been tools of preservation, he made them instruments of annihilation. The Will of Eternity's final act, falling from orbit to shatter Cadia, was perhaps the greatest insult to the Old One's legacy. A weapon they had created to save the galaxy became the tool that split it in half and ushered in an age of darkness. Yet even in this perversion, there remained hope of a kind. The Blackstone fortresses could not be completely corrupted. The Will of Eternity's machine spirit resisted Abaddon's control, helped the Imperial boarding parties even as Dravira Morkoth tried to stop them. The demon-possessed fortress, driven mad by chaos influence, remained unstable, dangerous even to those who theoretically controlled it. The fortresses remembered on some level what they were meant to be, and fought against being turned into something else. Whether this resistance stemmed from actual consciousness, or merely from programming so fundamental it could not be overwritten, remains unclear. But it suggests that even the most powerful weapons retain some connection to the intent of their creators, some kernel of original purpose that cannot be entirely erased. The Blackstone fortresses stand as monuments to a war most races in the galaxy only dimly remember. They are reminders that the current conflicts, terrible as they are, pale in comparison to what came before. The war in heaven reshaped the galaxy itself, creating new races, destroying others, and leaving behind weapons that still function after millions of years of neglect. The fortresses embody this legacy, these massive structures drifting through the void, their true capabilities barely understood even by those who claim to control them. They are bridges between past and present, ancient tools being used to fight modern wars, with consequences that ripple across light years and centuries. In the end, the Blackstone fortresses became the deadliest weapons in the galaxy, not because of their warp cannons or their ability to destroy stars, but because of what they represented. They were proof that the galaxy's most dangerous threats often come not from new innovations, but from old ones, ancient weapons and technologies that resurface at critical moments to reshape the course of history. They demonstrated that ignorance and hubris could transform defensive assets into existential threats. They showed that even the mightiest fortresses could become weapons if one was willing to sacrifice them completely. And they proved that in a galaxy as old and scarred as this one, the past never truly dies. It merely sleeps, waiting for the right moment to awaken and remind the living that they build their civilizations atop the ruins of empires that fought wars beyond imagining, using weapons that still have the power to end worlds and split galaxies in half. Cadia fell. The Great Rift opened. The galaxy burned, and the Blackstone fortresses, those ancient mysteries wrapped in darkness and legend, continued their eternal vigil, drifting through the void, waiting for the next chapter in their billion-year story to begin.